great things about Bong Joon-ho's movies is that he's a person who is ultimately out to depict humanity in all of its beauty and all of its ugliness. He doesn't try to hide anything. He doesn't try to portray one side of society as absolutely evil or another side of society as just do-gooders. He is a much more complicated person than that. We can tell in movies like in Parasite, obviously, where the rich aren't just vilified for just being rich, and the poor aren't just made to be do-gooders just because they're poor. They're both complex people with complex motivations, and who both have redeeming and irredeemable qualities within them. And because Bong Joon-ho is a serious filmmaker who's able to capture people's humanity on film, it's not very easy to dismiss Bong Joon-ho's criticisms. He portrays everyone as flawed human beings, and so whenever he makes a criticism of anything, whether it's capitalism or it's just humanity in general, people pay attention. Now, in the last video that I made about Snowpiercer, I said that the next video about this movie is going to focus on the topic of capitalism, and that is indeed today's topic. Now, we have to remember that this movie, Snowpiercer, came out back in 2013. Now, 2013 was a long time ago, so just to refresh people's memories, back in 2013, the world had witnessed the Arab Spring, but prior to the Arab Spring, the world had also witnessed the Occupy Wall Street movement, which in turn was a reaction to the bank bailouts of 2008. Now, back then, when it became public knowledge that the Great Recession had been the direct result of financial mismanagement by the world's largest banks and financial institutes, along with government incompetence, people were enraged. The rage was so thick you could practically taste it, and that was why the Occupy Wall Street movement was started. Now, the Occupy Wall Street movement itself was leaderless and rudderless and it lacked discipline, but what it did manage to do was to plant a seed of thought into people's minds. It basically tunneled its way into the zeitgeist. Now, those people who had protested under the banner of the Occupy movement wanted to talk about serious financial, social, and cultural reform. They wanted a much more just and equitable society. Now, whether or not what they wanted was possible or whether or not it would have had any other unintended consequences is a different subject matter altogether. But it was during this time when Snowpiercer came out, and so when this movie came out, immediately the first thing that people did was look through the lens of the times that they were living in, which was a time when people were critiquing capitalism. Now, Snowpiercer is just chock full of symbolism, and it really struck a nerve with a lot of people who watched that movie. Early in the movie, there is a protest scene, and in that one scene, there are a number of angry people at the tail section of the train, and one of the people, one of the tail enders, takes off his shoe and throws it at a person whom he's really angry at, the target of it being someone from the front of the train. Now, immediately this scene, where the guy takes off his shoe and throws it at the other person, now that's immediately reminiscent of the time when an Iraqi reporter threw a shoe at President George W. Bush. Now, in the real world, George W. Bush ducked, and so the shoes didn't actually hit him. But in this movie, the shoe did strike its target. And that brings us to a really infamous speech that Tilda Swinton's character gives in this movie. Now, Tilda Swinton plays the role of Director Mason, one of Wilfred's underlings, Wilfred being the person who is in charge of the whole train. Now, in this speech that Mason gives in front of the tail enders before she metes out her punishments to the person who threw the shoe, she says basically that the train is divided into specific sections, that everyone has their roles to play, and that in order to maintain balance, in order to make sure that life goes on, everyone must keep their place. Everyone must know their place and keep their place.
Now, as in the beginning, I belong to the front. You belong to the tail. When the foot seeks the place of the head, a sacred line is crossed. Know your place. Keep your place. Be a shoe.
Now, when Mason delivers this speech, this immediately strikes a nerve with a lot of people, and that's because, again, we have to remember the timing of this movie and the circumstances that surrounded it. Whenever people critique capitalism, one of the first things that they always say is that in capitalism, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Now, personally, I don't think that is an accurate criticism of capitalism, but that is a different topic that we will talk about later. For now, what is important is that this helped to feed into the narrative that this movie was a criticism of capitalism. There are many other scenes that feed into this narrative as well. For example, when Curtis keeps on going with his revolution and takes over one car after another, each car that he enters is a manifestation of the different classes that exist in society. When he comes into the swimming pool, or the library, or the school, or the aquarium, all of those are manifestations of the middle class, of people who are educated enough to know that they are living in a system that exploits everyone else who are underneath them, but are comfortable enough to maintain the status quo. And probably the most important scene that fed into the narrative that this movie was a criticism of capitalism was the speech that Song Kang-ho gave when he talks about getting out of the train. Now, as Curtis's revolution reaches toward its end, he has reached the engine room and he just needs that gate open so they can confront Wilford. But Song Kang-ho says that he is not interested in opening that gate, he's interested in opening another gate, and he points at a side door. Now, the reason why the side door is important is that the door that Curtis was pointing at, the engine room, would simply take him to Wilford, but the side door, once it is open, would lead to the outside world. Now, the outside world in this movie is quite dangerous because it is a frozen hellscape. The moment people step outside, people would freeze to death. But Song Kang-ho's character says that the side door has been shut for so long, and has always been there, that people tend to think of it as a wall, but it is not a wall, it is also a door. And the only way to really escape from the train is not to go to talk to Wilford, but to leave the train. And immediately the symbolism lands like a punch to the gut. The sacred engine, the thing that keeps the entire thing moving and everyone alive, is capitalism. But what has that actually brought for society? The rest of the train is humanity. Humanity doesn't divide into their each individual cars. People who are stuck there for the rest of their lives. And is that a just society to live in? Is it fair? Is it equitable? Now, eventually, the side door gets opened via an explosion, and that leads to an avalanche that derails the entire train. Now, only 2 people survive, 2 children, and they emerge from the train. And this, again, landed as another huge blow. This was symbolism galore, that the only way to escape from capitalism, the only way to escape from this unjust society, is not to replace the leaders or to play along with their games, but to just derail the whole thing, destroy everything and start anew. And this was a lot of the arguments that was made by those who had participated in the Occupy Wall Street movement. But was this really a movie that criticized capitalism? While I've definitely heard some critics say that it was, I've never actually heard Bong Joon-ho say that it was. And to be honest, while I believe that the movie was certainly a critique of classism and authoritarianism and dictatorship, I don't really think that it was a criticism of capitalism itself. And there are quite a few hints along the way. Now, one of the scenes in the movie that kind of gives us a hint as to what kind of society that the people aboard the Snowpiercer are living takes place aboard the train car where sushi is being served. Now, after Mason has been captured by Curtis and the gang, Mason leads the gang toward the engine room. And as they progress toward each car, one of the cars that they get to is a car where they serve sushi. And Mason mentions that they are lucky that they arrived on that day because, as it turns out, sushi is only served twice a year, once in January and once in July. And presumably, the people who are allowed to eat the sushi can only eat so much of it at a given time. Now, the reason why the sushi is only served twice a year is that they have to make sure that there is an exact balance. They can only kill so many, they can only allow so many to live to breed, and only then can they maintain the perfect balance so that they can ensure that no species ever goes extinct. Now, the reason why this scene provides a huge hint that this society is not a capitalist system is that this extreme measure of maintaining a balance in an ecosystem is not a hallmark of a capitalist society. One of the criticisms that is often levied against capitalism is that it is a rapacious economic system, that it is a system that consumes far more than it is able to produce.
It came to me when I tried to classify your species. I realized that you're not actually mammals. Every mammal on this planet instinctively develops a natural equilibrium with the surrounding environment, but you humans do not. You move to an area and you multiply and multiply until every natural resource is consumed. And the only way you can survive is to spread to another area. There is another organism on this planet that follows the same pattern. Do you know what it is? A virus.
Now, while I don't personally subscribe to that argument so much, what is indeed true is that capitalism is an economic system that is driven by consumerism, and consumerism isn't all that keen on thinking about maintaining a perfectly balanced ecosystem. Now, another scene that just drives home the point that this is not a capitalist system is when we eventually meet Wilford. Now, earlier on, Mason has already talked about the need to keep a balanced population. Now, I don't know how much Mason really believed in this, but Wilford definitely believes in the necessity of maintaining a population balance. But unlike how much further had Mason said, Wilford does not really think that the application of a population balance applies to only fish. For Wilford, the necessity of keeping a population balance also applies to people. From the very beginning of the movie, Curtis receives these messages from an anonymous informant from the front of the train that feeds him information as to how to lead the revolution. And using these messages from this enigmatic person, Curtis leads his revolution, and this violent revolution that ends up killing a lot of people, from both the tail section, the middle section, and the front of the train. But as it turns out, these messages were sent by Wilford himself. Wilford fomented his own revolution. And the reason that Wilford fomented this revolution that was aimed at himself was so that people would end up killing each other. He believed that the people aboard the train had been reproducing far too quickly and that resources were unable to keep up with them. He needed people to kill each other so that there would be a perfect balance, so that the species, so that life would keep on going. Now, the need to keep a healthy balance by maintaining a strict population control is not something that I've ever heard any serious capitalist make. The only two public figures of any seriousness that I've ever heard make this argument was first Thanos in the Marvel movies, and the other one was Paul R. Ehrlich. Now, Thanos himself needs no introduction, so I'm going to just skip that part. Now, Paul R. Ehrlich. He was a biologist from the University of Stanford, and he became really popular in the 1960s. Back in 1968, he co-authored a book with his wife, and that book was called The Population Bomb. In that book, Ehrlich said that starting in the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people would die of starvation, and that would be because humans had just become far too numerous. There's an overpopulation, and that the resources that we were able to produce would not be enough to meet the demands of people to, basically eat. Now, unlike Mason or Thanos, Paul R. Ehrlich never did say that we should kill half the population, but what he did say was that for humanity to survive, there would have to be strict population controls, and what he said was that it had to take place by compulsion if voluntary methods failed. Now, the argument that Paul R. Ehrlich made was purely Neo-Malthusianism. Now, Neo-Malthusianism, of course, being derived from the name Malthus. Malthus was the first person who actually really publicly talked about how the world was going to be doomed because of overpopulation. And Paul R. Ehrlich just gave it a 20th century spin to that. Now, Malthus was proven wrong within his own lifetime, as was Ehrlich, because obviously hundreds of millions of people did not die per year because of starvation. But in the real world, capitalism is not the economic system that has stalled humanity or forced people to stay in their stations in life. Capitalism is the economic system that actually helped humanity to thrive. If we look at all of these different charts that have been produced by the World Bank or the IMF, what we see is that the number of people who live in absolute poverty have fallen dramatically. And it's not only the number of people who live in extreme poverty that has fallen. People's life expectancy has also increased over the years. Now, am I an unapologetic cheerleader for capitalism? True. Guilty as charged. But that being said, I also recognize that capitalism is not the economic system that has resulted in us living in paradise. There are a lot of things that are still wrong with this world. For example, if we look at the Gini coefficient, the chart that measures global inequality, that has gone the other way. Inequality has definitely worsened. Now, if we look at income, it is obvious that the number of people who live in extreme poverty has definitely fallen. But income alone does not tell us anything about quality of life. It does not tell us anything about the happiness that people feel. And of course, the most compelling argument against capitalism is that the economic system that we all live in has allowed for the emissions of greenhouse gases that now threatens humanity as a whole. So yes, there are a lot of problems, some of them much larger than others, that remain yet to be addressed. But that being said, again, once we go back to this movie, once we look at all of the hints that have been given, the society that Bong Joon-ho is criticizing in Snowpiercer is not the capitalist system. It is something else. So if it is not the capitalist system that Bong Joon-ho is criticizing in this movie, or at least not what he thinks he's criticizing, then what society is Bong Joon-ho criticizing? Well, that's a topic for another video. And that's the end of this video, so if you liked it, don't forget to click on the like and subscribe button as well as the notification bell, and if you have a comment, leave it down below. I'm John Lee, and I'll see you all next time.